You are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is August 3rd, 2025, and this is another episode of Lighthearted Light. That's Lighthearted, L-I-T-E. Today we're going to listen to an edited version of a conversation with a lighthouse keeper's daughter in British Columbia, Canada. It was first heard in episode 104 in early 2021, so let's get right into it. Jim Bruton was born in Wales in 1926, but his family relocated to British Columbia in Canada when he was just 1 year old. He started working in the logging industry as a boy. After serving as a merchant seaman during World War II, in 1945 he became an assistant keeper, or junior keeper, at Leonard Island Light Station off the west coast of Vancouver Island near Tofino. After working in the logging industry again for a few years, he returned to light keeping in 1958 as a junior keeper at Discovery Island. After a year and a half there, he became the principal keeper at Crome Island off the east coast of Vancouver Island for 4 years. He then returned to Leonard Island from 1964 to 68. The Brutons eventually had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy. The family moved to Sheringham Point, a mainland light station in Shirley on the southwest coast of Vancouver Island in 1968. They lived there for nearly 2 decades until 1986, when Jim Bruton retired. Our guest today, Alani Bruton, lived at the light stations with her family until she was 18. She remains an active volunteer for the Sheringham Point Lighthouse Preservation Society, which now owns the lighthouse and surrounding land. By the way, in this conversation, a man named Fred Mountain is mentioned in relation to the ghost stories at Sheringham Point. To set the stage, Fred was the next to last keeper at the station, and he died there suddenly. You'll see that information will be useful when you hear that part of the discussion. So let's listen to my conversation with Alani Bruton now. What's the first light station you can remember?
I can remember Discovery. I was 2 when we went there, or had just turned 2, and I can remember quite a number of things at Discovery Island, including climbing the water tower when I was 4, which I wasn't really supposed to do. Mm-hmm. Probably my first big spanking.
That's pretty good at 4. Wow.
I was a little bit independent. My mom was teaching my 2 older siblings, and she had the baby. And so I had a tendency to wander and make my own entertainment and, follow Dad or the dogs or whatever I could get into.
What else do you remember about those early stations, Discovery Island and Crome Island?
Discovery Island, it was a little lonely for my mom, I think. There was a senior keeper there, Shelto Fox, who we stayed in touch with and right up until he passed away. Shelto was a bachelor, and so we were the only other people there, except for there was property on part of the island that was owned by a fella named Captain Beaumont, and he would come over and stay in a house he had there, but there was no sort of social contact for my mom, no female contact. So that was her first experience to lighthouses. She told my dad she would give it 6 months, and at the end of 6 months she was starting to enjoy it, so they decided to stay.
Well, I'm glad she enjoyed it, because the family ended up having quite a few years at the lighthouses.
We sure did.
Yeah, just about 30 years in all, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what about Crome Island? What do you remember about that?
Crome Island, when we went there, was a one-man station, so again, fairly lonely. It's not a very big island, but it was close to the south end of Denman Island, and we got to know an old bachelor who lived over there with a multitude of cats. You could go over, and he had a shack, and we would go over in the boat, and he would say, "Oh, here, kids, look at this," and he'd pull a box of kittens out from under the bed or out from under the stove, and there were cats everywhere. So that was entertaining for us as little kids. But the water there was quite warm, too, so it's where we all learned to swim, including my mom. And our house was very old. It was in pretty bad shape, so they decided to build another house. But what they decided to do first was build a junior keeper's house, because the first summer we were there, we logged more hours of fog, I think, than had ever been logged. And it was really too much for one person to look after everything. That particular light at that time still had to be wound at night. The weights had to be wound up twice a night.
Okay.
So you've got a keeper who's got to be up twice during the night, plus up and turning on the fog alarm engine off and on all night long and all day long. So it was a little bit too much for one person.
Sure. So after Discovery and Chrome Island, the family went to Leonard Island.
Back out to Leonard, a much larger station, a 3-man station. So there was Dad and 2 junior keepers, and sometimes there were keepers with other kids. One family, Joan and Ian McNeil, they had 5 kids. At least then we had some kids that were our own age and, fun to play with. I think growing up in that situation as a kid, when you don't know anything else, you're not lonely. You make your own entertainment. But nevertheless, when someone came along and we had other playmates, it was enjoyable, that's for sure.
One of the things, I think it was in the interview you did with Rebecca Quinn that I saw on YouTube, you talked about the large lens at Leonard Island. It was a first-order Fresnel lens, right?
Yes, it was. And you could get right inside it and stand up. It was quite they're when you see those big lenses, they're quite a thing of beauty.
Sure are. Back to life at Leonard Island. You were homeschooled there, is that right?
We were homeschooled right from the get-go. The correspondence division of the Sault School Board would send out packages. Okay, you're in this grade, this is your package, and it was sequenced throughout the year. So when you got your package, we didn't take holiday vacations like at Christmas or Easter or anything like that, or long weekends. If we wanted to do our schoolwork during that time, we did our schoolwork, which resulted in, and set our own hours. So that resulted in us often having our schoolwork finished in May. And we would head out on vacation off of the island. Dad had built a trailer we towed behind the car, and we would go and visit family and friends whose kids were still in school, because they were in the regular school system. It also meant that if we were having a day where the weather was good and as children we were having difficulties concentrating on our studies, Mom would get fed up with us. She'd say, here's your lunch, go to the beach, and I don't want to see you guys back here for 2 hours, but you're working till 6 o'clock tonight. And we'd be like, woohoo, and off we'd go for a 2-hour lunch break.
We'll move on to Sheringham Point. Now, you were, about 12 years old when the family moved there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I had just turned 12.
Okay. Life obviously was quite different at Sheringham Point, being on the mainland, compared to the offshore stations where the family lived. Would you say it was better overall?
I think it was much better for my parents. Mom finally got to have a bit of a social life. Neighbors could come and go, and people popped in to visit on a fairly regular basis. And I think that she no longer had to teach us. She continued our studies to the end of the school year, and then we were enrolled in the local school. And so she finally got to have that break. She had been teaching us for many years at that point, and getting into the higher grades and newer math and newer things coming along, she would have to stay up until all hours of the morning to study our lessons for the next day in order to teach us. So that was a huge break for my mom.
How about you? Did you take to it quickly? Did you like life better at Sheringham Point than the earlier places?
You lost a lot of freedom as a kid. So you're moving to this place that now you can't just go around willy-nilly and have 2-hour lunch breaks. You've got to get up in the morning, get on a bus, go to school, and you're stuck there all day.
Yeah.
So that loss of freedom I think it was really felt by all of us.
Yeah, I can see that it'd be take a lot of adapting.
On the other hand, it was nice to have neighbors and have people pop in and be able to drop off at a neighbor's and have a visit. So that was good too.
Sure. It sounds like a lot of people visited the lighthouse at Sheringham Point, as I did 5 years ago. I got to visit there, but there were no people there, of course, now.
A lot of people visited.
Yeah.
It was featured in some magazine. I don't even know what magazine, but in the U.S. And so we had people who came up because they saw that article. So they came from the States to visit. Mm-hmm. And then we had It was featured on the cover of the telephone book in the Victoria area, and that brought a lot of visitors out.
I read that there were 4,000 visitors one year, which might not sound like a lot compared to some of the, leading tourist attraction type lighthouses, but for a fairly remote place like that, 4,000 is a lot of people. And I'm just wondering, when visitors showed up there, what did they expect? Did they expect maybe somebody in the family to give them a tour of the place, or what were they hoping to get out of it?
Some people expected it to be a place where they could just come and hang out. Mm-hmm. They wanted to picnic there and, practically set up camp, I think, not realizing or not understanding that it was not that sort of a site. I remember arguments ensuing on occasion with people who said it's public property and you're a civil servant, and because it's public property, we can come and do what we want here. But it was not that accessible. Most people, I think a lot of people wanted to go up in the lighthouse, but that was closed to the public. And some people you would take up on a tour and that, but we weren't tour guides. We were there to do the work of the Coast Guard.
Well, I've heard similar stories. I've heard about like lighthouses in Maine where visitors would just walk in the front door and sit at the kitchen table and expect service and that kind of thing. So
yes.
they had to start locking the doors, I think. So I have a book here, Sheringham, a Canadian Heritage Story, that was written by Rebecca Quinn with help from various people. I know you were quite involved in it yourself. But we'll talk more about the book in a little while. But one of the things that's mentioned in the book is that tame deer are very common around Sheringham Point. The book tells about, there's one deer especially, I think, that meant something to your family.
Yes, there were deer there when we went, and they had been fed by the mountains. Fred and Nellie had been hand-feeding these deer, so, of course, as kids, we were delighted. They would come up, and you could pet them, scratch their ears. They ate out of your hand. They were very, very tame. But people came down one day. I happened to be over visiting Mom and Dad that day, and it was early in the morning, and these people drove in the gate, came up and knocked on the door. They had been driving down from Up Island, from Port Renfrew, and had seen this little deer on the side of the road. So they stopped to investigate, and it was alive, but it had just been born. It was very tiny even for a newborn. The deer here often have twins or triplets, and we suspect it was probably a triplet. It was quite small. My parents had toy Pomeranian dogs, and it was no bigger than the little Pomeranian dog.
Wow.
So we got a hold of the local veterinarian, and the Game and Wildlife people knew that we had tame deer, and we were able to raise this deer, or Mom and Dad were able to raise this deer, and she named him Don because he was found at sunrise. And one of his favorite foods was graham crackers, and he would come and walk in the house even when he had horns and looking for his graham cracker. Very, very tame, very friendly.
I guess so. Besides the deer, I imagine there's other wildlife around there. How about bears and cougars, any of that?
Yes, bears, cougars, raccoons, otters, you name it. It's there. We had chickens in a chicken coop, and they would come out during the day and, wander around the yard and stuff. But one little bear decided that he wanted to eat the chicken feed. So Dad looked out, and here this bear had stuck his head through the little door that the chickens would come out of. And so Dad picked up a grass rake that he had there and went up to the chicken coop and whomped it across the rump with the grass rake. And the poor little bear, he just about fit through that little square door. He came out huffing and puffing, and it scared the heck out of him, and off he ran. And I don't think he ever came back, I think.
He learned his lesson.
He was just, that was a good fright for him. Cougars, we did have cougars in the area. Unfortunately, one of our junior keepers shot one of them one day from his kitchen window, and we didn't really do that sort of thing. We like to have them around, and when you've got a lot of deer, you can expect that, you're going to have a cougar in the area, and there was no reason for him to have shot it. It wasn't doing anything.
You mentioned chickens a minute ago. First of all, were the chickens for eggs, pretty much?
Yes, they were for eggs. we also had somebody in the area who had some ducks and wanted to get rid of their ducks. And so we took the ducks and had those for a while and ate their eggs as well. And at one point, Mom and a neighbor decided they wanted to raise some geese, and we got some eggs and incubated them. I think we only ended up with one goose out of it, and he became such a pet we never would have been able to eat him. So, so that sort of thing. I had a horse for a while, and my dad twice had bought a young steer or heifer and raised it there for meat, and then took it off and had it processed so that they could have the meat from it.
So where else did you get your food? Was there a store you could actually drive to from there?
Yeah, there was a store in Sooke. It was only 12 miles from the lighthouse, so we could go in and get supplies there into the city, into Victoria. And when you live on the more remote stations, the lighthouse tenders, the ships, brought your supplies, and you ordered them for 2 months at a time, so that you could, if the lighthouse tender came up once a month, but if the weather was bad, they couldn't offload, and so they would wait for a short period of time, 24 hours I think it was, and then they would call and say they had to keep going because they had all of the other stations on their line. They had all of their supplies and their perishables, so they had to continue on their way. And so you always ordered your supplies to last 2 months at a time. It wasn't unusual at Leonard for the families, the wife and kids, to not get off for 6 months at a time.
But at Sheringham, you bought your own food.
We bought our own. We just went to the local store like everybody else in the neighborhood.
Almost everything you read on the internet about Sheringham Point, and the book also talks about it, there's a ghost story connected to it. What can you tell me about the ghost at the Sheringham Point Light Station?
My family believes that it was Fred Mountain. And it's interesting because this book came out, and my brother's 5 years older than I am, and he's one of the people who saw him in our house. I was down just the other day to visit my brother a few days ago, and he said, that book you gave me, he said, when I opened it up and I was going through it, he says, I came to this picture of a man, and he said, I thought to myself, that's the guy.
Holy cow.
That's the guy I saw in Mom's and Dad's house.
Wow.
So he says, I'll find the picture for you. So he opened it up, and he showed me the picture, and I said, yeah, that's Fred. And he said, that's the guy. He said, I was sitting there in Mom's rocking chair, which faced down the hallway, and the door opened to Mom's and Dad's, or to one of the bedrooms down the hall, and this guy walked up the hallway and went into Mom's and Dad's bedroom. So my brother looked around, and everybody was there, and he said, I just saw a guy go in the bedroom, and Dad said, what are you talking about? He described the fella, and Dad said, oh, that's Fred Mountain. And my brother said, who's Fred Mountain? And so he said to my parents, can I go in your bedroom? And they said, well, sure. So he opened the door and went in. There was no one there. Mm-hmm. And so, and Fred, certainly we felt that he had come in through the basement door one evening when my sister and I had gone to bed down in my room. We had company staying in her room, and we heard somebody come through the double-locked basement door and walk across the basement. The basement light was on, and so you could see light out from under my bedroom door.
Yeah.
But there was no shadow that went past the end of our door. And if somebody normally was walking by, there would be a shadow. They went up the stairs. They stopped at the top, and two of the stairs creaked. And when this, whatever it was, went up the stairs, we heard them go up the stairs, but the stairs didn't creak. And they stopped at the top, didn't open the door, turned around, came back down, went out the door, and we were like, holy smokes. So we gone up, because we had checked the door when we went to bed, and it was locked, and it was the only other door in there, open from the outside. The door was still double locked, and we went upstairs, and everybody was accounted for. We don't know what that was, but we assumed it was Fred.
Was it scary when you're hearing those things?
No. We were not raised to be afraid or fearful of things we didn't understand.
Right.
And so when we first encountered, the first strange thing that occurred, we just said, oh, well, it must be Fred Mountain, or it's somebody, and then it became, well, it must be Fred Mountain. And certainly after he was seen by my brother, and also a neighbor lady saw him in the same hallway, and she knew him very well, and she saw his image as well.
Wow.
And they used to visit quite often, and they knew Fred and Nellie really well.
Yeah.
And so we were like, well, from everything we'd ever heard, he was a very kind and gentle man, and we had no reason to fear him.
Yeah.
So we were like a little disconcerting, when it's late at night and you hear somebody going past your bedroom door and nobody's supposed to be there. But yeah, it was just one of those things.
Well, it kind of fits into there's a lot of stories of, similar stories of lighthouses, light stations, possibly being, I don't like the word haunted, but visited by, light keepers of the past. And to me, it's, these people are so attached to their stations, so devoted, that it makes sense to me that even, after they've left this plane of existence or whatever, that they might still be hanging around in some form. So,
I may go hang out there myself.
Yeah. I wouldn't blame you. I wouldn't blame you at all. Did you and your siblings learn to operate the equipment, the light and the foghorn?
We did. All of us did. It certainly at Chrome Island from a very early age, we all knew how to put the light on or to start the foghorn. Foghorns are under pressurized air. There's usually a big tank that's involved for the compressed air, and it was important for that tank to always have some sort of charge in it, because we might need to use it if something had happened to our parents, to use it as a signal. And the same at Sheringham, although there we did, after a couple of years, get a telephone, and so we had another method of calling out and getting some assistance. But when we were on remote stations where we were the only ones there, and as kids, we might need to sort of find a way to alert boats or whatever that we were having a difficulty, and to get some assistance for ourselves.
I understand you didn't have a boat at Sheringham Point. The station didn't have a boat, which is kind of amazing to me. Did that create any problems? Wow.
We had a situation where there was Dad and a neighbor had gone fishing. They had gotten a small, maybe a 12-foot aluminum boat. It was quite a small boat, and they had managed to get it in the water at Sheringham, which is, as you know, is just a rocky point. But they got it launched, and they went out, and they were just right off the point doing some salmon fishing, and they looked up, and a squall was coming down the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and it was black and looked nasty. And there was one other small boat about the same size out there, and so Dad yelled at the fellas, and he motioned them in, and they sort of waved, and he yelled again, and he pointed to this weather cell coming down on them. And they just sort of waved him off, whatever, sort of a wave, and carried on. There was nothing Dad could do. They carried on heading towards Souk, and Dad and the neighbor came into the station, and they saw this weather cell catch up to this little boat, and it disappeared into it because it was just a thick, nasty little storm coming down the Straits. And they were never seen alive again. That was the end.
Wow.
They discounted Dad's warning, and they really shouldn't have. Both bodies were recovered later, at a later time. So that sort of thing. Had he had a better boat, he could have possibly have zipped down to them and said, no, you guys need to get off the water now. But without a station boat, we couldn't do that.
Yeah. You weren't actually living there towards the end of the family stay there.
No.
Is that correct?
That's correct. I had been away from home for some years at that point.
Yeah. But I'm wondering if your father or the family had any feelings about the station being automated and being the last family there, as far as, just a big transition.
We weren't in agreement with automation. I can't say that even today that I'm in agreement with all of the stations being automated. I know some are still manned, and I think that that's a good thing. Certainly seeing search and rescue out there today looking for someone or something just says to me that somebody should be there looking out a little more closely for our local people and for people who get themselves into difficulties out there. It's easy enough to do. But as for leaving the station, my dad was ready. It was time to go.
Here's a sad part of the story here. The local fire department there burned down the keepers' houses and other buildings at Sheringham Point, except for the lighthouse. How did you and your family feel about that?
I don't like to see what I consider to be historical buildings burnt to the ground. I really was not happy with it. My family wasn't happy with it. It's because once it's gone, you can't bring it back. It's unfortunate.
I read in one article that your family planted daffodils at Sheringham Point, and I think the article is from 2013, and it said they were still blooming. Is that true? And are the daffodils still blooming there today?
That is true. There were a few clumps of daffodils that were doing very poorly because they hadn't been tended to in years. So we dug them up and separated these big clumps and moved them all over the place and replanted them. And it's quite spectacular to go down there in the spring and see them blooming. They're quite lovely. They're doing very well.
I have 2 more questions for you for bonus points. Okay, so get ready. And this will go on your permanent record. So
there you go.
Okay. First, why do you think the lighthouse should be preserved? Why is that important?
We have such an extensive maritime history in this country. When we close up and stop acknowledging these areas or places that were linked to that maritime history, we lose a portion of it. We lose a portion of the history. And I don't think we should be doing that. I think our history should be preserved and keep it as intact as possible.
Couldn't agree with you more. So my final question, again for bonus points, what was your favorite thing about being a lighthouse keeper's daughter?
Wow. I think being given the opportunity to have the independence that only children in remote locations have. That remote location gives kids a huge opportunity to connect with nature, and I think that was probably one of the best things for us kids growing up on the lighthouses, was to have that connection to nature. I'm going to throw back at you bonus points.
Okay.
When people are talking about lighthouses, maybe not as much these days, but the historical information about lighthouses is we forget the sacrifices that the lighthouse keepers' wives made.
Right.
They went to remote locations and stayed. And when I talk about lighthouse keepers, I talk about my mother and my father being the lighthouse keepers, as I do with others. And certainly these days, there are more and more women who are lighthouse keepers. But the women who went to lighthouses, some of them didn't have children. Some of them had children that they had to raise and teach, as my mom did. And it's not something that should be forgotten, that it was a partnership with those women as well. I remember my mother operating the winch in days when she only wore skirts, and having this skirt pulled up and tucked up between her legs to be safe so that she didn't get her skirt caught into the equipment as it was running. It takes a very special kind of people to go out there and make that commitment to lighthouses.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's a very important part of lighthouse history. I really appreciate you spending this time with me today. Thank you so much, Elani Bruton.
Thank you, Jeremy. It was wonderful having a chat with you.
You can learn more about Sheringham Point Lighthouse at sheringhamlighthouse.ca. On the website, you can purchase the book, Sheringham, A Canadian Heritage Story by Rebecca Quinn, which is the best source on this light station. You can also get a book called To the Lighthouse, An Explorer's Guide to the Island Lighthouses of Southwestern BC by Peter Johnson and John Walls, with photography by Richard Paddle. Both Rebecca Quinn and John Walls have been on this podcast. Sheringham Point is a beautiful place, and in general, I recommend that if you can make a trip to British Columbia, do it. I promise you won't be disappointed. Be sure to check out uslhs.org to find out about preservation grants, tours, the passport program, and all the things the U.S. Lighthouse Society offers. Please also check out the YouTube channel at youtube.com/US Lighthouse Society. I just posted a video I put together of our recent tour in France. We'll be back with a new episode of Lighthearted next Sunday. Until then, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, keep a good light.
I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.